Like Dr. Barr said, I'm Dr. Miller, psychology professor here. A few years ago, Dr. Barr and I realized that we had a shared interest in spaceflight and NASA. We've kind of bonded over that interest over the past few years. And I guess it wasn't even last fall, it was before last fall, he asked me if I'd be interested in giving a talk for the big Space Day in celebration of the anniversary of the moon landing that we had last fall, and I was very happy to do that. So this is a version of that talk that I gave last October, and it's really going to focus on what you see up there, how science fiction and predominantly Arthur C. Clarke, we're going to be talking about some other folks as well, kind of got the American mindset like ready for space travel, trying to primed our mind for space travel. Because if you think about it, none of us were alive, right, in 1940. It was an outlandish idea. It seemed way, way out there. We went from not being able to fly, not being able to get off the ground, to landing on the moon within a single individual's lifetime. So it took a lot of doing from a lot of people, and we're going to focus on one of those aspects today. Now, why am I giving this talk? You mentioned I'm a psychologist, which means a couple things. I'm not a historian, right, at all, so historians might cringe by my talk. I love history, but I'm not a historian. I'm not a literarian. As I mentioned in October, I'm still not convinced that that's actually a word. My wife, who's an English teacher, swears it is, people who study literature. But I'm not a literarian, I'm not an engineer, I'm not an astronomer. I do have a very passionate interest, though, in space and space travel. So this is a couple pictures from my kind of disorganized office to show you some of my interest here. It's covered in books. Pretty much all of these books are science fiction, fantasy, or nonfiction having to do with spaceflight. My house is even worse. You might not be able to tell in this bookshelf here, but behind all of these books are more books. And my wife is like, are you ever going to actually read all of these? And I was like, if I live to 150, I think I will. But if I pick up the pace, maybe. So this is something I like to do in my free time, right? We always say never stop learning. I love psychology and I love teaching psychology, but when I'm not doing that, I like to learn about things outside of my field, right? It's where some of my passion is. So I want to set the stage a little bit here for like where we were and how we got to where we were. It kind of gives you some insight here into what the mindset was, like if you were just to survey the average American and ask them what they think is going to happen. So I'll explain this chart in a little bit more, but it's going to be sort of supplemented by some stuff we're going to get here on the right. When we look at any kind of scientific progress that we make, sometimes we look back on it retrospectively and we're like, yeah, of course, that was going to happen, right? It feels like it was just destined to occur. That's definitely not the case. Like manned spaceflight, putting people into space was not inevitable. So not inevitable, in fact, that if you asked people, take a little snapshot in 1949 about what they thought the future was going to look like, they did not conceive of that as really a realistic possibility. So they asked individuals in 1949, basically 50 years from now, so in 2000, what do you think will happen? What do you think the future will hold? About 88% of them, so about 9 out of 10, thought we'd have a cure for cancer. Obviously we don't, right? It's 2020, still no cure for cancer. They were very optimistic on that front, right? They thought, okay, cure for cancer is going to be coming. We're going to rely primarily on atomic power. Over half said, yes, this makes sense. This is right after the beginning of the atomic age. Does anyone know the year we dropped the atomic bombs in Japan? I know John does. Decade? 45. There we go. 45. So this is 4 years after. That really launches, it's on the American mindset, right? Atomic power. So we're thinking, okay, that might be one of our primary energy resources going forward. Men and rockets will reach the moon. Only 15%. So we've got half of Americans thinking we're going to rely on atomic power. The majority of Americans think we're going to have a cure for cancer. Very few think we're going to put men on the moon. And we do in 20 years. They're not asking them, what do you think is going to happen in 1969? They're asking them, what do you think is going to happen by the year 2000? This reflects just how outlandish the idea was. Like, we thought there's no way. Like 2050 years, we're not going to be able to put men on the moon. And that belief took a really long time, even as we got closer and closer to 1969, when we actually did put men on the moon. That belief still wasn't quite where you would expect it to be. That's what this chart is showing. So that 15% is when they asked Americans in 1949. Jump forward to 1955. It's gone up, right? But we're still only at 1 out of 3. By 1959, so that's just 10 years, like 1 decade before we actually put men on the moon. I've been teaching here for 7 years. So like, to me, a decade is not a very long time. Only half think that that's possible. And then look at this, 1965, it's a little small, might be hard to read, but it says 1965. That's 4 years before we actually go to the moon. Slightly over half think we'll be able to do it within the next 20 years. So this really was an outlandish idea. It took some priming to get the mind ready for even the remote possibility that this was something that could occur. Going back to kind of what I said at the beginning of class, part of this is because just the very concept of flight was new to us. So the first flight occurred in 1903, and it was like 25, 30 feet off the ground. It was like more of a glide, right? But it was a proof of concept that we can fly. So we're going from saying, okay, we can fly, to now we're going to shoot people up into space, we're going to aim for the moon, we're going to land on it, and then we're going to bring them back safely, right? Because that is the goal. And this has kind of captured the skepticism around this from some early nonfiction writings having to do with space. So in 1936, Philip Cleater said, most people either do not believe that interplanetary travel is possible, and interplanetary here, they're just referring to planetary bodies, right? So the moon counts. Or else they are utterly indifferent toward it. It's so remote, they don't even conceive of it. They don't even really care about it, right? There is no indication that the situation will be any different in the immediate future. That's a pretty good quote to capture kind of where the mindset is in 1936. Anyone else know what large-scale thing is happening in America in the 30s, economically? The Great Depression, right? It's pretty far from most people's mindset at this point in time. We're not thinking about going to space when we're thinking about where our next meal is going to come from. R.C. Truax, which is going to have a very interesting quote on the next slide as well, who worked for the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics in 1954, said, "There is simply no overwhelming rational reason why we should try to set up a station in space, send a rocket to the moon, or take any other steps along the road toward interplanetary flight." So when you read that quote, you might look at this, and this is 15 years before we land on the moon, right? I think this guy is anti-space travel, right? He's saying there's no logical reason why we should go there. In fact, the opposite was true. He recognizes at this point in time, he can't conceive of a rational reason to go there, but he argues we should do it anyway. He said, the majority of people in this country are excited, right, by space travel, like he is. He's a strong supporter of this. If they're excited by it, the arguments of immediate utility are unnecessary. So on the one hand, he's saying there's no rational reason to go. On the other hand, he's saying it doesn't matter. He says, as humans, we're naturally curious. We explore. We've explored throughout our entire history. And he says, that's the next stage of exploration. Let's see what's out there. So he's saying, despite the fact that there's no rational reason, we should do it. And we can do it if we get other people excited by it. That's one of the key roles that science fiction is going to play. It's going to generate some of that excitement. It's going to make people not only feel that it's possible, but feel that it's worthwhile just because they want to do it. Think about what you do with your free time. Imagine you have free time, right? If you've got some free time, you typically are going to do the stuff you want to do, the stuff you're excited to do. Think if you're doing a research paper. Think about the best research paper you've ever written. It was probably something that you were interested in, right? Something that sparked an interest in your mind. And that's what he's saying we need to do here. We need to spark that interest. If we can do that, we can get the American public behind the idea of space travel. Now, World War II ends in 1945, which talked about that atomic bomb, right? This, after the Great Depression, is where the American mindset is. We've just been in war, right? We've been a part of the war for 4 years. We're not really thinking at this point about, okay, now let's go to the moon. Let's engage in space travel. That's going to change very, very rapidly. So, Robert Coles, who was the chair of the Hayden Planetarium, the Hayden Planetarium is still around in New York, said it is obvious to all concerned that any project of such magnitude, such as the conquest of space, can be successful only if it enjoys the full support of the public. So we've got some pretty convincing arguments here that public opinion matters. It's not just a small group of scientists saying, we're going to go to the moon, we don't care what the public thinks. It's not going to be possible without public support. You're going to need to generate that public support. So you might think, well, why doesn't NASA do that? NASA could generate the public support. NASA itself does not exist without public support. So NASA didn't exist until 1958. It took a movement and a generated interest in spaceflight, space exploration, space travel to create the body, right, that would help us do these things. So Walter MacDougall wrote a really interesting book called The Heavens and Earth, A Political History of the Space Age, where he talks about a lot of different factors. And he identifies 3 primary kind of driving forces that were necessary just to launch the space program in general. One, from a large scale, is a rich economy. Right? Obviously, in the Great Depression, we did not have a rich economy. Post-World War II, we started to generate a fairly wealthy economy. 2, appropriate technology. There was a huge technological boom, right, in the 50s and 60s. So these are 2 things we're not really going to talk about, but the prerequisites, right? You got to have a rich economy, you got to have appropriate technology. The third one to me is the most interesting. You have to have imagination. just much more abstract, right? These are two very real, very concrete things that we can point to and be like, okay, do we have that? Do we have that? Imagination's a lot more nebulous of a concept. Like, can you even think of it? Can you think of a way to do this? And he's saying we have to have the requisite imagination to even conceive or make spaceflight viable or even possible. So going back to the Gallup poll, 1949, we're saying we need imagination. We saw in 1949 it's not there, right? 15% of people, I would say Americans aren't really having the imagination in 1949 that this is possible. They're not thinking 50 years from now we can even do it. It'd be like if we surveyed Americans now. I'm trying to think of a question that we would get a result that low. Maybe if you surveyed Americans now and asked them, will we have a cure for cancer in the next 50 years, the number would be as low as 15%, potentially, because we've struggled with it for so long. It's just not something that we're being able to conceive of at sort of the midway point of the 20th century. That will change, and I think a part of what will change that, it's certainly not everything, but I think an underrated and under-talked about part of what will change that will be science fiction. Because science fiction has a unique way of grabbing someone's attention that might not even be initially interested in it and making them broaden their horizons. And a part of science fiction, part of the goal of science fiction, I think is captured well by Ray Bradbury, who's one of the grandfathers of science fiction. He says, and he has a very general definition of it, which I like. Science fiction is any idea that occurs in the head and doesn't exist yet but soon will, and will change everything for everybody and nothing will ever be the same again. As soon as you have an idea that changes some small part of the world, you are writing science fiction. It is always the art of the possible, never the impossible. There's a long history of science fiction predicting things that end up happening. And I don't mean like an oracle, like we're seeing into the future. No, we know what's going to happen next Wednesday. But predicting developments, not just in technology or exploration, but predicting sociological developments, predicting anthropological developments. And obviously there's a lot of weird predictions that are totally wrong in science fiction too, but it's the idea of like throwing things out there and imagining what the future could look like, not what it currently, the present, looks like. So this started way before the 20th century. And we're going to start with two people that kind of set the stage here for science fiction because they end up having a really important impact on some specific individuals that end up being very important in the history of spaceflight. Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. How many of y'all, have any of y'all ever read anything by Jules Verne or H.G. Wells? What have you read, Rachel?
I've read part of War of the Worlds, and I've read Around the World in 80 Days.
Around the World in 80 Days, War of the World.
A little over half of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Anyone else? Yeah. If you have read, especially Jules Verne, H.G. Wells is much easier to read. If you read Jules Verne, it was a time, which it's funny that you said you read half of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Yeah.
How many of y'all have seen the War of the Worlds?
It's actually a good question. I haven't seen it.
Which version?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I watched a little bit of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't.
Based on that, I think.
So I've read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I've read a few Verne. I'm getting Verne and Wells confused now. Verne is much harder to get through because it was a time where you were more or less paid by the word. So Verne's like, let me describe fish in a lot of detail in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But they do have an ability, especially when you think about when this stuff is written, which we're going to get into in a minute, to capture an idea and kind of run with it in a very creative way. So I think we're going to start here with Verne. And he publishes a book, and this one's actually a fairly short one. It's one of the more easy ones to get through, called From the Earth to the Moon. It was published in French initially, right? Because Jules Verne, shocking, right, is French. Published in 1865. Before we get into that, anyone else know anything about 1865? Does that date stick out to anybody?
Mm-hmm. Sorry. No, it's okay.
Yeah, you guys are all right? It's Civil War, right? It's the end of the Civil War. So that helps place this in the appropriate context. One of the things that I find really interesting about history, like the best history classes I took in college, were the classes that connected things, like they put things in the proper context. Because a lot of times we learn history in isolation, like I'd learn about the Civil War, then I would learn about what was happening in some other part of the world. It's really interesting to think about what's happening at the same time, right? So the Civil War in America is ending. Jules Verne publishes this that year. So this is a long time ago, right? 1865. We call it From the Earth to the Moon, right? Translation. It's a pretty simple concept in this book. There's a group of, he calls them weapons designers. They're basically, that's what they're doing. They create weapons and they decide they want to do something interesting with their weapon designing experience. And that is launch humans toward the moon. Now they have a kind of weird way of doing this. They're going to use a huge cannon. So the idea is we're going to basically put people in a cannon and launch them to the moon, which to us now might seem a little nuts, might seem a little outlandish. In the book itself, the launch is successful. They leave orbit, right? They leave the atmosphere. He leaves the fate of the astronauts at that point unclear. So he doesn't tell you what ends up happening to them. The interesting thing about this is, think about it. It's 1865. We don't have planes. We're still like 40 years away from developing planes. And he's thinking about getting people to the moon. That's way out there, right? Think about the imagination it would take to even conceive of that as a possibility. Certainly we can see the moon. So he sees the moon and he says, I bet we could get a person there. I'm going to try to write a book about how we could do that. The book itself is full of calculations. Most of them are wrong, but he made an attempt to try to make some rudimentary calculations here. There's formulations. He does get one big idea that ends up being kind of mind-blowing that he got it right. He suggests using rocket power, like boosters, right, for trajectory corrections, which is sort of a simplified version of what we end up actually doing. And we don't have rocket power in 1865. And he's talking about, we don't even really know what a rocket is. And he's talking about using that to correct the trajectory of a launch. This is very influential. Again, within the context of 1865, the American Civil War ends. The first speed limit is introduced in Britain. It's fast. It's 2 miles an hour, right? And obviously, we're not talking about cars here. I'd have to imagine this is like horses, maybe. I'm not even sure. The telephone didn't exist yet. So he's talking about putting people in rockets on the moon before the phone even exists. Telephone's about a decade away from being invented. The Model T wouldn't be invented for 43 years, right? So almost half a century. So this is very progressive. This is very forward thinking on Jules Verne's part. The first solo transatlantic flight, so just going, let's say, from like New York to England, right, would not occur for 52 years. So way, way, way ahead of its time. Because of that, it captures the attention of some very important people. And in the book, Verne does an interesting thing. He talks about the plot, but he also inserts a little bit of himself in there. I think a lot of authors do this. You're going to see, I'm going to show you that Clarke did this a lot. So within the plot, within the characters, he expresses, I think, what are probably some of his own beliefs. So see, these are some quotes directly from the Earth to the Moon. How many things have been denied one day only to become realities the next? What do you think Verne might be trying to say there? Like, what's the point of that statement? Think about, again, the context of 1865. He's saying, look, you might look at this and think this is nuts, this is insane, how are we going to be able to do this? But that's happened over and over and over again in history, where we think there's no way we're going to be able to do that. Oh, and all of a sudden we can. So he's saying if we can imagine it, we can make it a reality. Science reached them in every shape. It penetrated by the eyes and by the ears. It was quite impossible to be an ass in astronomy. Here he's just valuing science. He's saying, look, a scientific way of thinking, a rational way of thinking here has inherent value to it. And then, if we were to believe what certain narrow-minded people maintain, humanity would be enclosed within a magic circle and condemned to vegetate on this globe. He's saying, look, continuing to push the boundaries, continuing to explore, continuing to think outside the box is important in terms of our growth as a species. If we don't do that, we'll stop growing, right? We'll just sort of stagnate. And of course, we don't want to do that. So, finally, he wraps up with this. I have a great esteem for men of science who know what they are talking about and a great contempt for those who do not. Again, he's talking about just the value of science here. Keeping in mind, this is over 100 years before we land someone on the moon, right? He's setting the stage. So, these three individuals are three very important scientists in the early days of rocketry and developing rocket science. Tsiolkovsky, Goddard, and Oberth. All of them had their attention in some way captured by Jules Verne. There's a reason we talked about Jules Verne before talking about these individuals. So, they've all specifically cited, and I'll show you how on the next slide, in one way or another, not just Jules Verne, but specifically from the Earth to the Moon as one of the big influences on them. And if you look at the dates here, they don't all completely overlap, but they're all born, right, in the 1800s. So Verne publishes this book in 1865. It's been around for a while when these guys are growing up, and it captures their attention, a lot of them at a very young age, and it kind of puts their mind down a path that ends up directing them towards some very important things in the development of rocket science. So, Tsiolkovsky said, my interest in space travel was first aroused by the famous writer of fantasies, Jules Verne. Like that initial seed of like, this is something I want to look into, was captured by science fiction. Herman Oberth, according to his biography, read Verne at least 5 or 6 times and then finally just knew it by heart. right? Didn't even, think about if you've ever read a book over and over and over again that you just really love. You don't need it to be cited or watch a movie over and over again. You just know the lines. Obviously, they didn't have movies back then. This was like Oberth's movie. He's watching it over and over and over again, and he just knows it. Robert Goddard, really considered like the father of rocketry, right? The first rocket, Goddard standing right next to it, wrote extensive comments, and then this is hilarious to me, corrections in the margins of From the Earth to the Moon. So we mentioned Verne made a lot of formulations and calculations. Goddard was like, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And he went in there and he fixed it. But again, it's capturing his attention here. And of course, created the first liquid-fueled rocket in 1926, which sets the stage for the rockets that will eventually send us to space. All right, H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds. John just mentioned this. They made a couple movies off of this. I haven't seen the second one, mostly because it looked bad to me, so I didn't see it. But I have read the actual book. He was published this later than Verne, about 30 years later, right around the turn of the century, 1898. This one especially, like Verne captured Goddard, but so did War of the Worlds. And I want to mention this one because like it's very different than From the Earth to the Moon. From the Earth to the Moon is very scientifically based. If you could call it dry, right? If you've ever read it, it's not the most like engaging book. I find it really interesting, but again, we just talked about it's full of mathematical calculations. So War of the Worlds, completely different direction. We're talking about like an alien invasion here. So a totally different type of science fiction, but it still can capture the imagination. So this is a long quote, but I think it's a nice quote from Goddard. He says, and he actually wrote a letter to Wells later in his life, once he had been sort of established as a scientist. He said, in 1898, I read your War of the Worlds. I was 16 years old, and it made a deep impression. The spell was complete a year afterward, and I decided that what might conservatively be called high-altitude research, like rocket science, right, was the most fascinating problem in existence. The spell did not break, and I took up physics. How many more years I should be able to work on the problem, I do not know. I hope as long as I live. There can be no thought of finishing, for aiming at the stars, both literally and figuratively, is a problem to occupy generations. What this effectively did was capture and direct Goddard's attention upward, right? He's thinking about these problems, these issues of space flight, space travel, space exploration. Is there intelligent life out there? This isn't a very scientific book at all, but it is a science fiction book, and it's capturing Goddard's attention. And without Goddard, who knows how long it would have taken for us to develop space flight and space travel. All right, so we're going to flash forward a little bit, because there's some science fiction that's published in like the early part of the 1900s. It kind of comes sporadically, and most of it kind of fits a general trend up until 1949. Up until 1949, after the days of Verne and Wells, most science fiction is pretty outlandish. It's almost kind of comic booky. You kind of see this captured by the cover from, it was a serial that was published, a magazine called Amazing Stories. So short stories really start in like the 20s, 30s, and 40s in science fiction in a big way. They become the very popular way of discussing and publishing sci-fi versus like novels, right? Hugo Gernsback ran the most popular magazine, or the most common at least, Amazing Stories. And you see down here, there were people in it like H.G. Wells. They would publish stories in these magazines. People would pick up the magazines, they'd read the magazines, they'd get these stories. It was on radio programs as well. So the War of the Worlds very famously freaked a lot of people out, right? When they did it on a radio program, didn't really tell people what was going on. They turned the radio on, they're like, aliens are invading, and people thought it was real, which is just hilarious for us to think about now. It's like original fake news, right? They didn't realize that it was a radio program. They also had very popular radio programs like Buck Rogers, Space Patrol. This is referred to, this era, as the golden age of sci-fi. That doesn't necessarily mean it's sort of like the best age of sci-fi. I definitely don't think it was the best age of sci-fi. It's just the term we have for it. Within this age, sci-fi has taken a very different direction, certainly from Verne. It's gone from like maybe overly realistic portrayals or very dry portrayals to incredibly fanciful, like fantasy almost portrayals. A lot of the sci-fi that was published back then, we'd almost look at now as maybe more in the fantasy genre. I'll give you a couple examples of this. Probably the most popular book at the time, and I enjoyed this book, but it's a totally different kind of science fiction. It was written by E.E. Smith. It was the Skylark Space series. I think it's 6 books long. They're fairly short, but it's a series, right? 6 books long. And it created a genre that we are all very familiar with now, even if you don't know the term, space opera. Big, sweeping landscapes, huge battles. Think Star Wars, right? Star Wars is a space opera. But Star Wars is a very different type of sci-fi movie than like Interstellar. Now, how many of y'all have seen both of those movies? Right? They're very different from one another in terms of the type of sci-fi that there are. So this is the Star Wars kind of sci-fi that gets really popular in the 1920s, 1930s. The Skylark of Space is very entertaining. I enjoyed it, but very unrealistic as well. They're not really concerned with thinking about the real issues that might occur during space travel. They have exotic aliens, the classic green food, right? Far-fetched, very creative weapons. Not really concerned with the minutia of space travel or thinking about how space travel might affect us or the realities of being in space for a long period of time. So again, not rooted in realism really at all until 1949. That is going to change fairly dramatically. Anytime you look at any kind of like fiction, whether it's movies, even video games will do this. There's trends, right? Things that get popular in video games, things that get popular in movies, things that get popular in books. The same thing happened here with sci-fi. This was popular up until like the 1950s, and then a new kind of sci-fi is going to take over. And a big part of that, a big reason for that is Arthur C. Clarke, who we're going to talk about. So what happened? Like what caused this change to occur? Part of it had to do with like some seeds that were set earlier on. So in 1931, David Lasser published a book called The Conquest of Space. Now this book was a little bit different than the other ones that we've been talking about because this one's nonfiction, so it's not like a story, right? In this book, it's almost like a textbook. He talked about like foundational principles of spaceflight, like orbital mechanics in a basic way. The interesting thing about this is he published it in as simple language as possible. That doesn't mean he like dumbed it down, but he tried to make it readable. Like you've read a lot of stuff for college classes, right? There's stuff that's like really readable and engaging, and there's other stuff that's super dense and kind of tough to get through. He tried to make it really readable and engaging, which was very unique for the 1930s because he's trying to reach a broader audience than you would typically see from like nonfiction that would be published for something so specific during that time. Well, that's really important because in this book, he's describing in detail what a rocket launch from White Sands missile range might look like or does look like. Has anyone in here been to White Sands? White Sands is awesome. If you have a chance to get out to New Mexico, you can hike on these dunes. It's a national park now. Up until recently, I think it was like a national monument. It's a national park now, and it's really, it almost feels like being on another planet out there because they've got these huge white sand dunes everywhere. And because I think they're made out of gypsum, the sand does not get hot. So it can be like 90 degrees. You can put your foot in the sand, and it's ice cold. It's a cool place. But it's also where a missile range is. So it's talking about this missile range and talking about launching missiles from this missile range. It sent a very simple message. Like it's very complicated in terms of talking about orbital mechanics, even though it is doing that in simple language. But the overarching theme is that human spaceflight is happening. We're doing it. It's going to happen. It can happen. Here's some of the basics of how we can get it done. That ends up being important because Arthur C. Clarke, as a young man, ends up encountering this book. So he came across a copy, a used copy of this book. He's a kid, right? He couldn't afford it. I think his aunt bought it for him. So she bought him The Conquest of Space. He reads it over and over and over and over again as a young man, and it points his interest in that direction. It points his interests toward space travel. That's important because to me, this is obviously totally subjective, but to me, Arthur C. Clarke is the most important author in the 1950s for preparing the public consciousness for the possibility of spaceflight, for capturing the consciousness and directing it toward, hey, this is something we could really do. And that really started with this book. It could be one book, right? We saw Goddard talked about War of the Worlds. We saw Tsiolkovsky and Oberth talked about From the Earth to the Moon. For Clarke, it was nonfiction. It was The Conquest of Space. But you're seeing the role of writing, right, in capturing all of these individuals' attention. That ends up being really important because Clarke ends up, in my mind, kind of deciding to purposely use writing to capture and direct attention. We'll talk about how. Okay, so in this picture, Arthur C. Clarke is up there. Can any of y'all guess, based on this one, which one might be him? The one holding the rocket? No, he's not the rocket guy. There's something in this picture that's common in this picture. Could give you a hint.
Glasses.
Mm-hmm. He's the guy on the far right there, standing looking very serious, right? He was the chairman, which is funny that he's off to the right. I don't know if his picture was taken when he was the chairman, but he was the chairman of the British Interplanetary Society in 2 different stints. The reason I'm mentioning this is not a fiction organization. It's not like a group of authors getting together to write about fiction. This is a serious scientific organization. And he started in that realm. He started as a serious scientist investigating some of these things and then he ends up kind of transitioning to fiction. And I think he does that for a very specific reason that we will get into. So again, his career begins writing nonfiction. One of the books that he wrote that was fairly influential was called The Exploration of Space. He also wrote something called Interplanetary Flight, and in both of these really, not just Interplanetary Flight, he makes this argument that you can take this in kind of a step-by-step way. So he argued in the 7-stage model, at least specifically in Interplanetary Flight, that space exploration in general, from like going to the moon to like deep space exploration, is going to occur in 7 stages. And I think every single one of those stages, except for like maybe the first one, requires people, requires humans on the spacecraft. That's important because it's one thing to convince the American public that, hey, we can launch like a satellite up there that could send us some images around. It's a totally different thing to say we're going to put a person in a little like box, basically. We're going to shoot them up into space, and then we're going to bring them back, and everything's going to be fine. Right? That's a totally different. That's a big jump to make. And he's saying we're going to have to make that jump. It's a requirement for real space exploration. He then shifted to fiction. I think this is why he shifted to fiction. This is a quote I think later in his life. He said, "Most technological achievements were preceded by people writing and imagining them. I'm sure we would not have had men on the moon if it had not been for H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. I'm rather proud of the fact that I know several astronauts who became astronauts through reading my books." I think number one, he liked writing fiction. Obviously, he enjoyed it. But I also thought I think he knew that writing fiction was an effective way to capture people's imagination. And he recognized the importance, like we talked about at the beginning, of having that imagination captured, of capturing the American public, getting them to believe in these things. Because he's saying, look, we know other authors did it for specific scientists. Maybe we could do it for the average everyday person. So he shifts to writing fiction. And to me, one of his earliest works kind of shows where he was aiming with this. It's a book called Prelude to Space. I actually have this exact copy in my office that was written in 1951. So this is pretty early on in Arthur C. Clarke's career. In this book, it's not like a sweeping epic tale. It's a pretty basic story. It's short though, so it's pretty easy to get through. It's a pretty basic story of the world's first spacecraft capable of reaching the moon. That's it. He's talking about this is the first spacecraft that's going to go to the moon. It describes in detail, kind of like Verne did, the launch process, how the power source is going to work. It also talks about a 2-stage mechanic. Do any of y'all know what I mean when I say 2-stage mechanic? Think about like Apollo 13. They show this basically in every space movie where they launch and then they detach, right? And part of the spacecraft goes floating down. He's talking about that in 1951, that you could do this using a 2-stage mechanic. He's coming up with this initial idea. This was published a full 12 years, so over a decade before the Apollo program, right, to go to the moon even started. So before Apollo even exists, he's talking about the ways in which we might be able to do this. In it, importantly, he kind of has like a couple big themes. Number one, spaceflight's realistic. Keep in mind that 1949 Gallup poll. This is just 2 years after that. So he's trying to convince the readers of this book that, yes, this is something that we can do, and it's something we're going to do, because he's describing it. He's imagining a world where it has already happened. Now, the interesting thing about the book is he has a pretty, in his mind, aggressive timeline for when this was going to happen. It wasn't even aggressive enough. He estimated it happening like, I think, 10 to 20 years after it actually ended up happening. So he thought, I think 70s in the book, if I'm remembering correctly, maybe 80s he thought it would happen. Obviously, it happened in the 60s. He also recognized, so Arthur C. Clarke was British. Not sure a lot of people know that. We talk about him a lot in America because he's an important figure like in American fiction, but he was British. He recognized the importance of America being a part of this. So he describes American scientists working on this. He thought America would have to be the driver of this program. He recognized sort of the geopolitical situation in 1951 and thought America was going to have to be one of the forces that made this happen. So in 1976, actually in this version of the book, this preface is in there because that's the version from 1976, he published an interesting sort of, you could call it a preface, it's almost like a postscript to the book, where he describes kind of his mindset when he was writing it. Because when I first read it, I kind of thought to myself, like, I wonder if he was doing this intentionally. Like, I wonder if he was really trying to convince the American public of this. He basically said so in 1976. He said, now, contrary to general belief, prediction is not the main purpose of science fiction writers. Few, if any, have ever claimed this is how it will be. Most of them are concerned with the play of ideas and the exploration of novel concepts in science and discovery. What if is the thought, it should say, underlying all writing in this field. So he's saying, look, we're not trying to predict things, blah, blah, blah. But then he adds this, which is interesting. Yet, it must be admitted that the stories of space travel, specifically, form an exception to this general rule. The pioneers of astronautics used fiction in a deliberate attempt to spread ideas to the general public. So they're doing this intentionally, right? Tsiolkovsky, Oberth, and von Braun all wrote space fiction at one time or another. In so doing, they were not merely predicting the future, they were creating it. So he's saying the purpose of sci-fi in general is not to create the future, it's not to predict the future. And then he's giving himself a little bit of an out, right? He's like, no, but maybe space travel, that's different. And he's writing about space travel here. I think I've got another quote up here. He says, yes, I must confess that I had similar propagandistic ideas in mind when planning this book. It was written in July 1947 during my summer vacation as a student in King's College, London. So he did this intentionally. He's saying, I wrote this basically as propaganda, right? I wanted to convince people that this was something that could be done. That was the goal of my writing this book. And he did this at a young age, right? He wrote it in 1947 while in college, published in 1951. This is pretty early on in his career. He's setting the stage for a trend, a theme that he's going to continue throughout his career. So, in the 22 years between the writing of this book and the actual landing on the moon, because this is in the preface from 1976, our world has changed almost beyond recognition. The following pages may serve as a useful reminder of the way in which the public attitude toward space travel has also been transformed, particularly in the United States. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, but if any of y'all know anyone, I mean, you know someone who's got some experience in this classroom with it right now, that was alive during this time, sorry to date you, John, but people that were alive, right? We're talking about the 70s, like my parents were born in 1960, right? So I can talk to them about this. They were 9 years old when the moon landing happened. It was like the dominant force in the consciousness, which is kind of crazy to think about because in 1949, given that poll, we're not thinking about it at all. Really. So in like 10 years, we go from not thinking about it to being obsessed with it. And that's what he's talking about here, how you can transform the attitude of the publicness, of the public sort of consciousness. And one way you can do that is by using sci-fi, by using fiction. And I think he was doing that intentionally here. Now, Arthur C. Clarke was super prolific. Like a couple years ago, I decided, I'm going to go buy and find every Arthur C. Clarke book to add to that ridiculous library you saw. Ended up taking like an entire shelf in the library because there's tons. He wrote like all the way up basically until he died in 2008. So he's got tons of books. He also wrote a massive number of short stories. So I'm just summarizing a couple of them here to give you kind of like a wider breadth of what Clarke was doing, because Prelude to Space is really specific. It's kind of in the Verne style of a little bit dry, not as difficult as Verne to get through, but a little bit dry. Childhood's End is not. Childhood's End is very different. Have any of y'all read Childhood's End? All right, I had to read it in high school. Now, like in high school, this has changed a little bit. I think they give people more like, were y'all in high school when you had to read something? Were you allowed to pick the book you had to read, or was it assigned? Still assigned. Man, that sucks. So a little bit of both. Like my wife's a middle school English teacher, and in their school they don't assign books. They let them pick. It has to be appropriate reading level, right? I kind of like that model because you get to pick something you're interested in. But definitely when I went through school, it was always assigned, right? So freshman year of high school, this book was assigned to us. Like most books that were assigned to me in school, I dreaded reading it. I'm like, I'm not going to like it. I'd been burned by like 6 or 7 classics before that I didn't particularly care for. So I waited until 2 nights before we were having the test on the book to start reading it. I read it and finished it in 2 nights and loved it. And I think it really changed my life in some ways because it, number 1, turned me into a reader, and number 2, directed my attention toward sci-fi. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Childhood's End here, and some interesting things I think are going on in this that might not be as obvious if you were to read it. This was published a couple years after Prelude to Space. And it's a very different subgenre of sci-fi. I mean, it involves aliens, number 1, so that's going to be different. It's not quite space opera, but it's more like out there kind of ideas. So in case you end up reading it, I mean, it's tough to give a spoiler for a book that's like 60 years old, but I'm not going to ruin what happens. Essentially what goes on is aliens that basically look like devils come down to Earth, and doesn't this sound nice, right? Forcibly establish peace. So peace is good. The forcibly part, I don't know what's really going on there, but they forcibly establish peace on Earth. He sets this during like a moment in time that's important for us to understand, the Cold War, right? The cultural mindset at this time is that we might all destroy each other, right? So in Childhood's End, that's where the world is. It's about to destroy itself. We're about to just blow each other into oblivion, right? So if these aliens come down, they stop that. They establish peace on Earth. They had a secret mission, and this doesn't give anything away. Their secret mission was to prepare humanity for what they called the next stage of evolution. I won't tell you how they were going to do that, because it's kind of like the apex of the book, but they were going to do it, right? They're going to prepare us for the next stage of evolution. If you just read this, you might be like, this is an entertaining book. I don't really understand how Clarke would write this with any kind of propagandistic mindset in terms of preparing the American mind for space travel, because it's involved aliens and peace. But I think if you read between the lines, you can see some sort of hidden messages with what Clarke is saying here. So I'm going to show you this with some passages on the next slide. I think ultimately the message he's sending in this book is the only way for us as humans to move on, to evolve, to escape our inevitable destruction, because the Earth will be destroyed at some point in the future, right? The sun's going to burn up and then we're going to be gone if we don't kill ourselves before then. To avoid that, we have to explore. We have to continue to explore. We have to explore space. And if you look in the book at some of the passages in the book, I think he makes this argument. So we'll get back to that in a minute. These are some quotes by different characters in the book, and I'll kind of give you the context where necessary. The first one says, 50 years is ample time to change the world and its people almost beyond recognition. All that I required for the task are a sound knowledge of social engineering and a clear sight of the intended goal and power. This is a quote from one of the aliens. This is the alien talking about how they forcibly established peace. Now, there's a lot of things you could take from that. I think the thing I want to focus on is 50 years is ample time to change the world beyond recognition. He's saying within 50 years, if we understand ourselves well enough, we can achieve things that are both horrific, thinking about World War II, right, and the Cold War, but amazing, like space travel. So how we decide we want to direct our energy and resources is important, because 50 years, the world will change. Think about what the world looks like now versus just 50 years ago in 1970. It looks incredibly different. The internet, right, didn't exist. I'm thinking about what the world looks like now versus when I was in college. I graduated in 2008. That was only 12 years ago. It's completely different. The rate of change is accelerating. And I think even at this time, Clarke recognized that. He said, look, within 50 years, if we direct our energy and our imagination, our resources to the right places, we can achieve amazing things. All right, second quote here. It starts with a single individual. I'll tell you what they're talking about in a moment. Always a child, and then spreads explosively, like the formation of crystals around the first nucleus in a saturated solution. Adults will not be affected, for their minds are already set in an unalterable mold. He's talking about setting that seed of imagination, thinking about what is possible. And he's saying it has to be young people. And that's still true, not just for scientific exploration, but for any unique insight. We're always looking to young people. One of the reasons why we're looking to young people is because of what he mentions here. When you get to a certain age, it's hard to overcome this. You get set in your ways of thinking. And Clarke recognized that, and he said we have to capture the imaginations of children. And this is not even within the context of Childhood's End talking about space flight. It's just talking about thought and imagination and belief in general, and how that can spread and how change can occur. Think about some of the positive changes. We like to focus a lot on the negative, right? Think about some of the positive changes that have happened in the last 20 years. A lot of those changes, almost all of them maybe, have been driven by young people saying this is not how we're going to do this anymore. This is not how we're going to talk about this anymore. This is not what we're going to emphasize anymore. And then it spreads from young people. So it's setting that seed with young people. All right, and the message here again, imagination is critical to growth and innovation. It's critically important, especially important to reach youth, because they're the ones that can spread the message. All right, so I think this is the final passage I've got here. Across that abyss, there's only one bridge. Few races, and he's not talking about racial here, he's talking about species, really, unaided have ever found it. Some have turned back while there was still time, avoiding both the danger and the achievement. Their worlds have become Elysian islands of effortless content, playing no further part in the story of the universe. Their role's done, right? That would never have been your fate or your fortune. Your race was too vital for that. It would have plunged into ruin and taken others with it, for you never would have found the bridge. I think he's making a very important statement here that we are called to explore the universe. We feel an urge to explore the universe. I think he thinks it's a duty for us. It's a responsibility for us to explore the universe, but we're not predestined to do it. It's not just going to happen. We have to decide to do it. And if we decide to do it, there's going to be failure along the way. There's going to be danger along the way, which he mentions. But there's also going to be great achievement. So you've got danger and fate. You've got achievement and fortune. I think he recognized that things like this could potentially happen. How many of y'all are familiar with the fire in Apollo 1, right? I keep going back to Apollo 13, but it's portrayed in Apollo 13, right, where the astronauts were killed in seconds in the very first Apollo mission. It was just a testing exercise. I think he recognized that those sacrifices were going to be a part of this process. And then I guess I did have one more quote. No one of intelligence resents the inevitable. I don't think here he's saying that space exploration is inevitable, but I think he's saying that our resistance to change is inevitable. So our resistance to some of that progress, our resistance to getting out of our comfort zone, that's inevitable, but we have to do it. We have to push ourselves out of that comfort zone. And this is all happening in Childhood's End, a story about aliens coming to Earth to establish peace. And I think he's giving some sort of coded messages within the lines of that book. Stuff I definitely didn't notice in high school. Trust me, I wasn't sitting there in high school like, oh yeah, it's a coded message. I was just reading the book. I went back later and looked at it. In fact, I looked at it for this talk. I was like, I wonder if I could bring Childhood's End to this, because it's one of my favorites of his. All right, so 2 years before Childhood's End, so right around Prelude to Space, Clarke published a short story called Sentinel of Space. It's just called The Sentinel now. It's been sort of shortened, which he had written in 1948 for a BBC competition. So it's like he describes it, they kind of discovered it as like a beacon, right? Almost like a not really a homing device, but kind of like a ping to let them know that this race, humans, have developed to the point where we have intelligence, right? Why was it on the moon? The astronaut describes kind of like figuring out why on the moon, not on Earth. To give a reason for that, yeah.
Because he said that they would show their worthiness by leaving the Earth and venturing out to space.
Yeah, so it's a test, right? And think about what Clarke is saying there. They'll show their worthiness by leaving Earth, right? He's talking about the importance of doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, he theorized, and I think he actually said that aliens wouldn't want to deal with the savagery of other species.
Right.
So I think that also relates directly to believing that humans would be savages if we didn't further explore.
Yeah, it's you can see how much like in esteem Clarke is holding space travel, right? He's saying if we go to space, it proves that we're not savages anymore. Now, obviously, we still see a lot of savagery on Earth, even though we've gone to space, but that's how much he valued it, right? He's elevating it to almost this religious type of feeling where he's saying, look, this shows that we've kind of reached a higher calling. Now, there's something else that's interesting about this. I'll be honest with you, The Sentinel, it's not one of my favorite Clarke short stories, but it's an important one, a very important one that we'll see in a minute. What about the scale that Clarke is talking about? The scale of like the breadth of the story. Did anyone notice anything about that? It's kind of a confusing question I asked y'all, but like, is he talking about just the beacon on the moon, or is he talking bigger than that?
Certainly bigger. He said that there were likely many hundreds or even thousands of these beacons around the universe.
Yeah, he's expanding and expanding and expanding and expanding. And to provide a little context for this, right, 1948, we don't have a great handle on how expansive the universe is. We're starting to recognize it, but Clarke is theorizing that it goes on and on and on and on. Now, he specifically mentions, but he also very much implies, what does that mean about humanity's place in the universe? Do you think Clarke thinks that humans have a special place in the universe, or that there's nothing special about us? How many of y'all think something special? How many of y'all think nothing special, according to Clarke, not according to your personal opinion?
So small in the overall spectrum of the universe.
Yeah, so there's an interesting thing, because he says that in some language several times in the story. I think he actually is kind of saying both at the same time. It's like, I think both answers are right. He's saying, look, given the huge expanse of the universe, there's nothing special about our place in it, but we are special because we can recognize the expanse of the universe. We have an ability to explore this. Kind of goes back to the argument he's making in Childhood's End about like the value of space travel. We're special because we can do this, so we should do this, even though there's nothing inherently special about our place in the universe. I think he's making both arguments at the same time here. Now, the scale of the Sentinel is a part of the reason why initially it really was not very well received. So, first of all, the story didn't place in the competition at all, which is going to be funny when you see what ends up happening with the Sentinel. And Algis Budrys, which is another one of like the sort of fathers of science fiction, hated it. He said, one can raise a formidable reputation for profundity by repeating over and over again that the universe is wide and man is very small. While our instruments show that the universe is wide, they are our instruments and we manage somehow to build them. There is no evidence whatsoever that man is that goddamn small. So he was mad. He was not happy about this, right? It made him angry that Clarke would even imply that we are, he doesn't mean it literally, but like metaphorically, the center of the universe. And I think to me that's a little bit of a misreading of what Clarke was actually writing, because Clarke is saying that man is very small, but he's also basically recognizing this, that we have the ability, we've developed the ability, we have escaped beyond savagery to be able to explore some of these things. Another reason why the Sentinel ends up being so important is because a few years later, a director named Stanley Kubrick reads it. How many of y'all have heard of Stanley Kubrick? All right, one of the most famous directors we have, right, in cinema. In the 60s, Kubrick reads The Sentinel. He's really looking at a lot of different short stories. He was looking for a lot of source material because he wanted to make a movie basically about man's place in the universe, right? Yeah, y'all are going to watch, I guess, sections of it, because it's really long. But how many of y'all have seen 2001: A Space Odyssey? All right, for those of y'all that haven't, it's going to be weird, first of all. But to me, it's like hypnotically weird. Cinematography-wise, it's like one of the most amazing movies I've ever seen. When you're watching it, keep in mind that it was made in the 60s. And to me, that just like blows my mind with the visuals that are there. The first time I watched it, I hated it. I was in high school. The second time I watched it, which was like 15 years later, I loved it, right? It's one of my favorite sci-fi movies now. Kubrick read this and said, I think this might be some interesting source material. Why? Because this is fundamentally what Kubrick was interested in. Man's relationship to the universe. We just talked about, yeah, they're finding this relic, right? The relic might be a beacon, but it's also placing man, and by man I mean humanity, right, within the context of the universe, in the great expanse of the universe, and having this calling to explore the universe. So this results in it's still probably considered to be the best science fiction movie of all time. It's considered to be one of the best movies, period, of all time, which ends up having a huge influence on the public consciousness when it's published in 1968. Clarke goes back and ends up actually writing a book, a series of books, 2001: A Space Odyssey. He writes like 4 of them. I've read them all. I can't remember the years. It's like 2061: A Space Odyssey, 3001. He keeps jumping forward. But he writes the book actually after the movies are released. So he kind of like combines what happened with the movie because he worked with Kubrick on the script. Now, Clarke really didn't like the idea that people said that the Sentinel was the source material for the movie. He said that that was misleading and short-sighted. He was like, it's just an acorn. I don't think Clarke is giving enough credit to the Sentinel because it really is sort of setting the seed for what happens in 2001: A Space Odyssey. When you watch sections of the movie during the next class, you'll notice that there are definitely some pretty significant differences from the original source material, but the big idea, the general setting up and theming is the same. It comes from the ideas that Clarke is talking about in the Sentinel. All right, on to a much more controversial story that Clarke wrote. Yeah, go for it.
It's a book that, or that movie, which I think will interest you all. It introduces this concept of AI.
Yes, yeah. And is AI good or bad?
So I'm not going to say any more about that, but it's in 1968, and they're talking about that, and it's very interesting. So,
Yeah, I mean, think about some of the most pressing issues that we're talking about right now in terms of technological innovation. It's AI. Think about self-driving cars, right? Think about AI. One of the Super Bowl commercials was a car that can park itself with you out. You're not even in the car, right? You press a button. I was like, I want that. That's awesome. It parks itself. That's AI. And he's talking about that 50 years ago. All right, much more controversial short story, The Star. So essentially what happens in The Star, and this one's a little bit shorter, is it discusses a Jesuit astrophysicist who's like the lead explorer, right? In this group of scientists, who's experiencing a crisis of faith. Does anyone know why he may have selected a Jesuit astrophysicist, like his Jesuit as his denomination here? Y'all might not know this, but the Jesuits, yeah, Rachel.
I was going to say, it mentioned in the story the Jesuits are known as a particularly, maybe not, I don't know if scientific would be the right word, but that they are very invested in
Research-minded, yeah. Like the Jesuits have a long history of being very invested in learning, right? It's something that's been very valued. And there's actually a long history of like Jesuit theology and sci-fi in general. A book in 1996 called The Sparrow, which was written by, I think, a professor, and I think she became like a Jesuit theologian as well, deals with some of these issues as well in terms of space exploration and what's going on, and how they can reconcile that with their faith. Now, in The Star, which you read about, it doesn't deal with a mysterious relic left on the moon. That's an artifact from the last slide. What essentially is he discovering? Like, what is this Jesuit astrophysicist seeing in this exploration? Yeah?
He finds the ruins of a civilization that died out.
Yeah, so they're exploring, they're looking at a nebula, they're looking at a supernova that occurred, and they're going to investigate the origins of that supernova, and they find ruins of a civilization that used to be there. And he describes it in kind of a heartbreaking way to me. I found a passage here, and he said, one scene, it's a scene of the people that used to be alive before the supernova occurred. One scene is still before my eyes. A group of children on a beach of strange blue sand, playing in the waves as children play on Earth. So drawing that connection between our humanity. Curious whip-like trees line the shore, and some very large animal is wading in the shallows, yet attracting no attention at all. And sinking into the sea, still warm and friendly and life-giving, is the sun that will soon turn traitor and obliterate all this innocent happiness. That is a good example of Clarke's writing. That's very much how he writes. It's very descriptive. He's very specific with his words. He likes to draw connections and sort of tug on your emotions. He also uses symbolism a lot in this story. Did anyone pick up on any of the symbolism he used? I didn't pick up on it the first couple times I read it. I'll draw your attention to a couple pieces. In the first paragraph, it's like the second line, I think. He says, I stare at the crucifix that hangs on the cabin wall above the Mark 6 computer. I do my Roman numerals there, right? So he's got, on this one hand, this religious symbol. On the other hand, he's got this technology next to the religious symbol. He does that again on the second page, the beginning. I don't know which version y'all have, so it might not be the second page, but it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm not sure if I printed off the one I sent y'all. I think it's the 7th paragraph. It says the Rubens. So it says the Rubens engraving of Loyola seems to mock me as it hangs there above the spectrophotometer tracings. Again, religious symbol, technology. What ends up happening at the end of the story with the Jesuit priest? How would you describe how he experiences his crisis? Does he completely abandon his faith?
No, it kind of goes into
No. Yeah.
Kind of goes into explaining why God doesn't have to give us a reason behind what he does.
Yeah, so he continues to question, right? But he doesn't actually abandon his faith, really, at the end of his story. He's asking him, like, why? And there's a little bit of a twist ending that happens at the end. What's the twist at the end there? Science fiction authors love to have twists. It's a little bit hard to pick up on. Yeah, Rachel.
He calculates that the nebula, the explosion that created the nebula, would have been visible on Earth in the 1st century AD. And so he theorizes, what if that was the star over Bethlehem?
Right, so in his crisis of faith, when he's asking God these questions, right, he fundamentally asks, why? Why is this star that is a huge symbolic component of Christianity and this Jesuit priest's faith, right, the same thing that killed these millions of people in this civilization? That's kind of like the twist ending there, and that's the apex of the crisis of faith that he's experiencing. He doesn't resolve the crisis, he's continuing to experience it here, and he kind of like discusses it in the way that you mentioned, where he doesn't abandon his faith, but he continues to ask questions of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why, and I'm going to go to the next, I had it on there. Did I not have it on there? Okay, I guess I didn't put it on there. Let me make sure it's on the last slide. It'll be on there eventually because I saw it before class. We'll talk about one of the reasons why he's doing this. I think it's actually on the next slide. Maybe not. Okay, so what Clarke is doing, I'll just do it from memory here. He's making, oh no, it's there. I'm losing my mind. This is the point. It's because this threw me off, man. So he's making an argument here that's not, it was very, very negatively received, especially by the Catholic League at the time, because it was argued to be anti-Christian in a lot of ways. I don't think that's the argument that Clarke was making, because he has a sentence at the very end, if I can find it here, but I starred, where he says, there comes a point when even the deepest faith must falter, and now, as I look at the calculations lying before me, I have reached that point at last. He's not specifically only talking about religious faith here, in my mind. Certainly within the context of the story, that's what he's talking about. But I think he's arguing against the very concept of blind faith itself, because he's arguing really the value of questioning things in general. We should constantly be questioning. We should constantly be examining things like this Jesuit is doing, asking questions, following the research, following the evidence, and coming to these conclusions, not based on what we want to be true, but what we're seeing to be true. The Jesuit does not want this to be true. It's very clear in that story, but he continues to ask those questions of himself and to examine himself, and I think Clarke values that. And I think that's something you see in like his overarching themes within Clarke's fiction. He says, even if we never reach the stars by our own efforts, in the millions of years that lie ahead, it is almost certain that the stars will come to us. What do you think he means by that, the stars will come to us?
All stars
Yeah, so we're going to see them, right? If they go supernova or not, we're going to see them. Is there any other meaning you can glean from that? What he means the stars will come to us? You might not mean it literally.
The other races will come
Yeah.
to us. They will discover us before we discover them.
Yeah, he's saying the intelligent life that might be around those stars will come to us. Exactly. So isolationism, that's not even how you say it, is either a practical policy on the national or cosmic scale. So he's arguing, he's made a little bit of a political argument here. He's also making that and applying it beyond our political situation. And when the first contact with the outer universe is made, one would like to think that mankind played an active role and not merely a passive role, that we were the discoverers, not the discovered. I think you can tie that back to the end of the Sentinel there, where he's talking about, okay, maybe aliens left this beacon. Does that mean that they are happy with our progress, or should we be afraid of them? He's arguing, one of his arguments here is to explore, to be the discoverers rather than the discovered, right? Just look at history. History is littered with examples of a lot of times you don't want to be on the receiving end of being the discovered. A part of this, and I'm glad Clark was alive to see this because he lived till 2008, is the Voyager 1 probe. To me, this is tied with like landing on the moon. It's humanity's greatest achievement. I think it's mind-blowing what we've been able to do with Voyager 1. We launched it up in 1977. It's now it's actually a little farther now, 22 billion miles from Earth. It's been way past Pluto. It entered the interstellar medium in 2012. It's starting to shut down. It actually started to shut down a couple weeks ago. They're shutting it down. It's not going to stop moving, though. It's just going to stop sending us data. It'll continue moving. It'll drift toward the Oort cloud in about 300 years. We won't get data there, but we'll have sent it out. We did something really cool with Voyager 1. I don't know if any of y'all have heard of this. Are any of y'all aware of the golden record that's on Voyager 1? So there's a golden record, and this will tell you like how much of a nerd I am. I have replicas of the golden record. Actually, my wife got them for me for Christmas, and I'm like getting them framed and putting them out because they're awesome. And on that golden record are a selection of music from Earth, a selection of images from Earth, a selection of artwork from Earth. Carl Sagan, who died I think in 1992, really spearheaded that effort. He wanted to put a piece of humanity in the Voyager 1 probe, even though it's overwhelmingly unlikely that this will ever encounter another intelligent creature because it's just drifting aimlessly. But it was just the idea of doing it, like putting our humanity into this thing to send out our humanity to the rest of the world. So if someone else captures the Voyager 1 probe, they can see some of that. All of this ends up effectively capturing the American mindset to show you how effectively it's captured like in the 50s and then definitely the 60s. I've got a few examples here. We go into what we call the space age, where space and the thought of space dominates the American consciousness in like every way possible. Our advertising, think about what they're advertising up here using, like, I don't even know what the paint using space, they're using refrigeration using space, some cleaning product, which probably caused cancer, using space, right? They're Cheerios using space. They're doing everything space, right? In the 1960s, it's the dominant force in pop culture. You see this in what we watch, too. The Jetsons debuted in 1962. Lost in Space debuted in 1965. Star Trek debuted in 1966. There's a reason why all these things are debuting in the 60s. It's because space, space, space. We are obsessed with space. 2001: A Space Odyssey, which you're going to see next class, debuted and was released in 1968. It was actually kind of not particularly well received at the time. It was like a mediocre reception, but it was a very big commercial success, and historically it's been extremely well received. Music also involves space. I think, is Steve giving a talk about music? Yeah, he's going to give you a lot more. I'm going to come to that one because that sounds interesting to me. A lot more detail about space and music, but here's just a couple things that jumped out to me. The Byrds released a song called Mr. Spaceman in 1966. David Bowie was all about space for a long period of time, right? This is crazy to me. Space Oddity was released 5 days before the launch of Apollo 11 that ended up putting us on the moon, right? Rocket Man was released a little bit later. And if you look at the lyrics of Rocket Man, a lot of people look at them and they're like, oh, that's about cocaine. It's definitely, it's not about cocaine, actually. It's literally about a rocket man. It's based upon a short story by Ray Bradbury that follows the Illustrated Man pretty closely. So it's taking this science fiction and turning it into a song. It becomes in vogue in fashion. There was a group of fashion designers that used models that they called the space ladies, where they would just design them in this sort of future, what they call space gear, right? It started to be reflected in our architecture. So the Space Needle, 1961. I hate the name of this building so much. The Theme Building in LAX, very spacey, looks very Jetsons. Locally, the Astrodome, was called the Astrodome. Look at these dates, 61, 61, 62. Anytime you see architecture that's like that, you can have a pretty good guess as to when it was probably built, or at least what it was very much inspired by. It's this space theme that's getting reflected again. Tomorrowland at Disney World opened in 1971, and Tomorrowland, you could have any vision of tomorrow that you want. Tomorrowland, still now, but definitely very much then, was based around space. They've got the Astro Orbiter, Space Mountain, right? I don't know what the Astrojet is. I don't think that's there anymore. But they had a whole bunch of space stuff, right? In Tomorrowland, that was their vision of the future. Their vision of the future was space. All right, does it still matter? The answer is yes. So this is Charles Bolden, who is a NASA administrator. He gave this talk, which I think ties our talk today together very well. He said, we need planetary scientists, physicists, policymakers, and all the other usual suspects. Perhaps most importantly, we need public. It goes back to needing public imagination. One of the great joys of my job as an administrator is that I get to meet with students and teachers all the time and to remind them that everyone is needed when it comes to our journey to Mars. So now we're not talking about the moon. He's talking about that same public imagination with Mars. By everyone, I include educators, engineers, right? All sorts of different careers. He's talking about capturing everyone's attention. Every time a grandparent takes their little granddaughter or grandson to the Air and Space Museum, or to a planetarium, or even to a sci-fi movie, every time a young person shares a Facebook post about Scott Kelly, every time a not-so-young person he's talking about himself, gazes at the amazing images that he's put on Instagram, it gets us a little closer. He's talking about imagination and capturing that imagination and using sci-fi and using everything to direct that imagination. Now, do we still have, this is 2020 now, right? But do we still have the American imagination? Is space still relevant for us? The answer is yes, right? There's some stuff here that's going to kind of pop up that just shows this. Music, movies, right? Video games. Space is still there. We're not in the space age anymore. It's not like the dominant cultural force, right? But it's still something we're interested in. It's still something that grabs our attention. Think about the images that we see. These two images were all over the place when they happened. It captures our imagination to see people doing these things. Remember the eclipse a few years ago when everyone went outside? I remember our coworkers, we were going outside after I think a faculty senate meeting, and we were all looking up with the glasses on, right? At the eclipse, it captured our imagination. It still has the ability to do that. And I think a part of that has to do, and it still does it, I'll skip over that. These are just some science fiction.
Go back one.
Yeah.
To the woman on the right, Christina Koch, she comes back to Earth Thursday, and she has been in space she set the American record for a female in space. It'll be 328 days. We finally had that first all-female spacewalk, right? That was delayed and delayed and delayed. That's a reference to that, right? And think about that. That captured our attention. That was constantly on the news. We were constantly hearing about it. So, with respect to the American imagination, going back to Bolden, he says, sometimes people ask me, why are you so optimistic all the time? It's because of this enthusiasm, which we've been talking about. I hear in the voices of my grandchildren. And because people like you and your members are out there and continuing to believe in an incredible future. It's because people all over the world are looking up, just like Robert Goddard, and imagining a future where we have a permanent human presence on the red planet. And it's because every day I get to work with the most remarkable people who have dedicated themselves to make the impossible possible and to turn science fiction into science fact. That goes back to the quote from Bradbury about what science fiction is. And it's tying together with what Bolden is saying about the mission of space exploration. And I think part of the reason why this continues to capture our imagination, we're just going to skip over this because I really want to get to this quote at the end of because I missed it the first time, I want to hit it this time, is our place in the universe. This is probably my favorite picture ever taken. And it's nothing, basically, right? We're like, what an awesome picture, a little dot. Right? This is the pale blue dot picture, which some of y'all may have heard of. That Voyager 1 probe, as it was leaving our solar system, Carl Sagan instructed the people in charge of its direction to turn the cameras back to Earth one more time and to take a picture of us. So that's us. That's where we all are. And he has this quote, which is probably my favorite quote of like all time. And I'm going to read it to you. It's long, but I want to read it because I think it's absolutely fantastic, and I think it captures why we're interested in space. Look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer,
Every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors so that, in glory and triumph, they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity and all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. That's still the case. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit, yes. Settle, not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. I think that's a part of the great benefit of space exploration. It helps us understand ourselves, it increases our humanity, it helps us connect with other people and realize that our differences a lot of times are fairly minor and they can get very much exaggerated. It gives us that cosmic perspective of really where we are in the universe. That's it. I ran up right against my time, but thank you.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.